Bum, 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 bum. Hey everybody, come on in here. Today is going to be a special event. Today I'm going to put on trial two theories about what has happened and what is happening with the whole Russia meddling situation. Now, before I get going, let me give you some caveats and some warnings about what you see. The first caveat is that I'm not really good on facts. So if you see some facts here that need some fact checking, just say so in the comments, and the rest of you check the comments to see if I get anything wrong. So what we're putting on trial today is two theories about the Russia meddling. Theory number one is the one you've been hearing for, a year and a half. And that theory is that Putin and President Trump were in cahoots, colluding as it were, to win the presidency. And the idea there is that if that collusion was happening, there must be some kind of payback, something that Russia would get, in return for helping President Trump become President Trump. So that's one theory. The other theory I'm going to present and then compare is the theory that Russia is getting revenge, if you will, payback, for when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and allegedly she was behind interfering with the Russian political process, and Putin in particular, to the point of organizing protests, etc. So the two theories are that Russia was meddling in our affairs because they are pro-Trump and that they had something to gain from that. He might pay them back somehow. The other theory is that it's really about getting back at Hillary Clinton. Now, if that theory turned out to be true, it also makes sense that Hillary Clinton would have trouble running for president if the news came out that while she was Secretary of State, she had angered Russia to the point where they were attacking her during an election. So imagine if you're Hillary Clinton and you know that Russia is going to be giving you a counterpunch for interfering in their process, and you're the one who caused it, or at least it would look that way. Now, I'm not saying that's happened. I'm saying I'm going to compare two theories. One is that President Trump was in cahoots with Putin, and there was some payback understood there. That's the theory we've been hearing for a year that has not produced much fruit. And I'm comparing that to the theory that all of this has always been anti-Hillary Clinton. All right? And that's the only thing Putin cares about because she interfered with him and he's just paying it back. So let's look at all the evidence and see which of those two theories fits the evidence the best. Okay? So first we have the troll memes that some Russian entity, we don't know exactly what the Kremlin told this entity to do, but we know they have close ties, created these terrible, ineffective ads that at least science says had no impact on the election. I say science because there was a study at Stanford of all the different political ads and political contacts and found out that advertising in general kind of doesn't work. So this little bit that they did almost certainly didn't work. But that's not the question here. The question is, did Russia try to meddle, and for what purpose? Which two theories as to why? Now, one of our clues is that they started this meddling in 2014 before candidate Trump had, even come on the scene. So the memes suggest, especially since they continued after Trump got elected, suggest that it wasn't about him, because it started before him and it went on after he got elected. So that would support the theory that it was either about the country in general or about Hillary, which are somewhat connected, because the way that they would punish Hillary, if that's what they were doing, would be to go after the the country in general. There were the fake protests that the Russians were also behind, apparently, but there were so few of them compared to all the protests that happened everywhere. It's unlikely that these made any difference. And the protests, keep in mind that in at least a few of the cases, they organized protests on both sides. Now, if you're organizing on both sides, does that suggest that they were pro-Trump? I mean, it does not. So it doesn't support the theory that they were pro-Trump, but it is consistent with just punishing the country because they're really getting back at Hillary Clinton for interfering in their election. There's the Don Jr. meeting, which was a big nothing. Some people offered some information that they didn't have. He went, there was no information, there was no quid pro quo. There was really just a false pretense for a meeting. Of course, the critics of the president want to turn this into something, but if it were something, you would already see some indictments and whatever, but this is a big nothing. There's the dossier, which you don't hear so much about being Russian meddling, but maybe, could be. And because there were Russian sources, right? And every time there's a Russian source for anything, they're always attached to the Kremlin or they're a close advisor to Putin. So we don't know enough about the dossier, so we can't say whether whether Putin was behind any part of the dossier. But if he was, it certainly wasn't favorable to Trump. So that would also support the hypothesis. I'm going to call it a theory because it's not really science here. But this supports the theory that it wasn't about helping Trump, because the dossier certainly didn't help him. It was more about, it was more about just messing up the system, if you will. There's Hillary's server that got hacked, and here we have two sources to look for as to what happened. There's WikiLeaks, who got the hacked material and released it, and WikiLeaks has a spotless record of being right all the time, whereas the people who are saying that it was Russia. So WikiLeaks says it wasn't Russia, and they haven't been wrong yet. Our intelligence services are saying, yeah, it was totally Russia. But we've, in our own experience, we've seen them be wrong or lie fairly frequently, right? So in terms of credibility, this one, the credibility goes to WikiLeaks that says it was not Russia. All right. So we don't know, but that's where the credibility leaves us. So that would suggest also that it's not so much possibly not even a Russian thing. Then there's Podesta's email that was so easy to hack into that it's hard to imagine he didn't get hacked more than this if his password was literally the word password. This one, in the bigger scheme of things, I'm not sure how important it was. Could have been Russia, but certainly this is anti-Clinton. So if this was Russia, it wasn't, this could be seen as anti-Clinton as well as pro-Trump. We saw that the memes were designed to help Bernie as well as Trump. So in the run-up to, or in the primaries, Russia was apparently helping Bernie. So that suggests it's not so much pro-Trump, because remember, Bernie was polling ahead of Trump. So if the matchup had been Bernie versus Trump, you probably would have ended up with Bernie according to the polls. And if Russia was trying to interfere, they certainly were paying attention to the polls, and they would have known that helping Bernie would have been bad for Trump. So the fact that we know they were helping Bernie tells you it wasn't so much of a pro-Trump thing, because that wouldn't have made sense, unless it was just a mistake. If they just didn't know that helping Bernie could have been bad for Trump, maybe, but it would have been a pretty big mistake. So that suggests it was more anti-Clinton. Then you've got the 17 intel agencies. I've talked about this before, how the 17 intel agencies all say that Russia interfered. Now we know that, I think there's pretty good information that there's a Russian troll farm that did some stuff. So that part is probably true. But again, it's not clear that they were interfering pro-Trump. It seems that they were a little bit more anti-Clinton. Then we've got a couple other clues, which is that there's no Russian sanctions. In other words, we're wondering why Trump isn't putting sanctions on Russia. And I would suggest there are two theories for that. One is the first theory I said, which is he's been in cahoots with Russia the whole time. This is the payback. They helped get him elected, and now he's not putting sanctions on them. That's one theory. The other theory is that we know that what we're seeing is just payback. And if we pay them back, they got to pay us back, and we'll just be interfering with each other's elections to infinity. It may be that we just see this as, okay, we poked you, you're poking us back, we're going to ride this out. Now, our government could never say what I just said if it were true. I'm not saying it's true, because I wouldn't know. But if it were true, the government couldn't say that because we're not going to admit we're interfering with their elections. Sorry, my cat's going nuts over there. Anyway, when you put it all together, I would say that there's substantially more evidence for the theory that what Russia was doing is a little payback, and that it was personal in terms of Clinton related, and that I'm going to have to stop my cat in a minute. Boo! Cut it out. That it was personal, but the way that you got back to her is by going after the election. And now imagine that you were... Well, hold on just a second. Yeah, I'll be right back. This is Boo the cat, who was going wild on one of my files. I've taught her to... Oh, she doesn't like this position now. She sees the dog. All right. So, there you go. So anyway, imagine that you were Hillary Clinton and you were going to run for president, and you knew that Russia was going to come after you for a payback. Your best play would be to say, uh-oh, Russia's coming after me because Russia is in collusion with my opponent. Think about this. If Hillary Clinton knew that Putin was going to come after her in the election and make it harder for her to win, she would have been clever enough to anticipate that and set up Trump as the one who was working with the Russians, because you could always make a case for really anything. But if she hadn't done that, if you had never heard, imagine if you had never heard the theory that Trump was colluding with Russians. Suppose you'd never heard that. What would be your assumption if you saw that Russia was meddling with the election and you knew that the story was out there that Hillary Clinton had meddled with their election? What you would think is that, oh my God, Hillary Clinton is such a disaster as a leader that when she was Secretary of State, she essentially started a war with Russia. And actually during the election cycle, we're watching the war because the Russians are actually attacking our electoral process because Secretary of State Clinton, my cat's back at it, Secretary of State Clinton, crossed some line and got caught. So it's entirely possible that the Russian collusion with Trump is primarily a smokescreen to cover the fact that Russia was going to pay us back for a failed attempt at taking out Putin the same way. All right. But let me close by saying, in case somebody joined late, that there's no way to prove either theory at this point. We citizens... if you're looking at the 17 intel agencies and you're saying to yourself, well, that's reliable, I would remind you that these are agencies whose jobs are to fool people, right? Their job is to fool people, and they have a track record of being unreliable, especially lately. So you don't actually have, you as a citizen, I mean, not the government, but you as a citizen, you don't have any information of Russian collusion with anybody. You don't have that. You don't have any information of Russia meddling with the election either. You personally. What you have are news reports, and you have other people telling you it's true. But we haven't seen, for example, what is the evidence that they know the Hillary server got hacked? Well, they might know that. I would love to think that our intelligence agencies do know that we have that capability. But it has never been demonstrated to we citizens that they have that capability. We have no evidence that they have that capability. So we have only their word to take for it. Yeah, so it really wasn't. If you've ever lived in the real world, you know that when 17 agencies agree, it probably means something more like one of them looked into it in detail, a few other agencies helped them out a bit, but didn't see everything that the one agency saw. And then the other agencies said, well, we've worked with these guys before, we trust them. If they say it's real, on the surface it looks pretty real, they're probably right. We'll say we back them. So chances are 17 intel agencies agree really means something closer to one of them looked into it. And when I say one of them looked into it, what that really means in any kind of a big organization is that the boss decided. There probably was one person who decided that some of the information meant that Russia had meddled or not. So 17 agencies very quickly becomes one person in the real world. That's just the way things work. There's probably one person who knows all the details, whoever was sort of closest to everything. And everyone else is just taking that person's word for it, or maybe they've seen part of it. Maybe they talked to somebody who said it looked good, that sort of thing. Stop saying HRC emails, it was the DNC. Oh, you're right. Okay. So let me correct. That was a good fact check. So it was the DNC emails that got stolen. Is that right? As opposed to Hillary's. But in either case, the argument, with that correction, the argument is the same. All right, I'm just looking at your DACA prediction. DACA is hard to predict. Let me toss in one thought about DACA. So one of the big catching points in DACA is that the president wants to limit even the legal type of immigration. Now, I don't believe there's any way to scientifically determine what is the right amount of immigration, whether the lower number or the larger number are the big ones. But it seems to me that's a point of negotiation. So if I were the Democrats, the way I would get across the finish line is I would say, look, we have to make sure that we're letting in, lots of immigrants because we're Democrats, so we want lots of immigrants. I think the president could probably negotiate on that point, because as long as he's getting the vetting so that only the, qualified immigrants are coming in, it seems to me the more the better. It's hard to make an argument. So right now the president has an argument that doesn't make sense. So the president is arguing that, well, I guess it sort of makes sense. Let's walk through this. The president is saying we're going to carefully check any immigrants, so that they're merit-based, meaning that they add more to the country than they subtract. Now, to me, that is also the same as saying more the better. Because if they're adding more than they subtract, why don't we get more of them? right? More is better. Now, you could argue that they may be coming in and, taking jobs that Americans could have, but the employment situation is looking pretty good. And we can always revisit immigration rates in the future if we get too many, if it starts impacting jobs of people here. So I think the president should be, in theory, most negotiable on the point of how many legal people who have met the threshold of, whatever merit they determine. I think that's where you could be flexible, and I think that's where Democrats could claim victory, because they could say, "Look, we got in a lot of people, a lot of immigrants are coming in, but hey, we don't disagree with having some merit because we always had some merit." I mean, there's always been a little bit of merit. And then I think the stuff with the chain migration, that just screams negotiable. There clearly is some negotiable element to that. It could be that you can do, another way to negotiate it would be the president wants to get rid of chain migration, they want to keep it, he wants merit-based. So suppose you said this, we'll give you chain migration, but only for the merit-based people. In other words, the people coming in who have some means to take care of themselves and add more than they're subtracting. So I feel like there's all the people yelling no amnesty. You need to come to the real world. The real world where nothing works out perfectly. Everybody ends up giving up a little something. The path to citizenship for some amount of DACA is just going to happen. Whether it's right away or in a while, but it's going to happen. So fighting it seems like a waste of energy because you're just fighting something that's going to happen. So the chain migration you could tie to merit, and you could tie it to the number of legal immigrants, so that the chain immigration is where you're getting those extra immigrants, but they are also coming in on merit. Or perhaps there's, they can pay to come in. Perhaps, if you're bringing in a relative who can't pay for themselves, there's some, maybe extra fee you pay to bring them in, something like that. There are lots of ways to negotiate that. All right, that's all for now.